This is the GP Property Leases Webinar. I'm Tom and I'm just facilitating the chat today for Rebecca. She'll be guiding you through everything you need to know about GP Property Leases. As you know, this is kind of working in partnership with the LMC to deliver this training. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Rebecca and she can just introduce GP Surveyors and herself and then get started with the webinar about leases. Okay.
Hi everybody. So today we're going to go through GP property leases as part of the Cheshire LMC training guide. We'll go through what a lease is and when it's best placed to put a lease in place for GP property later down the line. But our agenda is to start off with what is a lease and kind of finish with how that will affect rent reviews under your lease, and then a question and answer session at the end. So if you've got any questions, happy for you to put them in the chat box as we go through the session, and then Tom can either stop at natural breaks and answer the questions, or we'll do them at the end as well. All right. So as a quick introduction to GP Surveyors and why we're helping host some of the training is we are specialist care surveyors, and we only deal with primary care premises, so we only work for GPs. We've been doing it for about 26 years now. And with that, we've been able to do everything from notional rent reviews right through to succession planning, which sometimes leads to sales of properties, and putting leases in place. We roughly work with sort of 3,400 GP practices. That number always goes up, and we definitely work nationwide, so we're up and down the country quite a lot. So in terms of GP surveyors, we've been kind of the leading specialist for a really long time, and then we've also branched out into other areas other than notional rent as well in the last sort of 15 years, I would say. If you did ring us, you'd see one of many team here, and they would be quite happy to help with everything. So there's some of our surveyors and some of our sales team on there as well. So without further ado, let's jump into what a lease is. So the formal document of what a lease is, the purpose of it is to regulate the occupation of the building. Now, it's a legal binding document, and it basically states who's going to be in the property, at what points they're going to be in the property, and at what obligations they have and rights they have underneath this property while they're in it. For any document to be considered a lease, it has to have all four of these things that's on the screen. So it has to name the property with its address. It has to tell you who are the parties, so who's the landlord, who are the tenants, and the document has to be signed. It has to tell you how long that lease is going to be in situ for. So, for example, is it going to be in situ for 10 years? Is it going to be in situ for 15? And then it also has to have a price. And what we mean by price is the rent, the initial rent that the tenant is going to be looking to pay the landlord within that lease. So that's what constitutes as a lease. I'm sure if you've ever had a lease, looked at a lease, you have a lease now, you'll know that those four things are very basic, and that equally a lease tends to be sort of 80 pages long, so you don't just have those four things in. But if one of those four things are missing, then it's really hard for that lease to be in effect. So when is a lease required? When is it something that you should be looking to put into effect at your property? The lease is to formulate the occupation of the building. So whenever there is an uncommon party within the property, a lease should be looked to be put in place. So what I mean by uncommon party is as soon as one of the owners no longer occupies the space, then there should be a lease in place. So for example, if you have three property owners and they currently all work within the premises, as soon as one retires and there is no route for buyout to buy that person out of the property, and they know that they're going to have to look after that property, a lease has to be put in place. A lot of properties don't put a lease in place at this point. However, this is when we would suggest that it's definitely needed. If you know there is no route forward to buy the retiring GP out, then we would look to put a lease in place. When a term is over 3 years, now what we mean by that is, for example, if you know you want to buy the GP out of the property, but it's going to take some time for whatever reason, you know from recruitment it takes a bit of time, or you know that the actual funds aren't going to be available then. If that period of time is longer than 3 years, so you know that actually it's going to take 5 years to buy that person out, you should put a lease in place. Now, normally your partnership agreement states how long you have to buy people out of property, and it's normally 12 to 18 months from the date of retirement. I would say that if you don't have the luxury of potentially buying somebody out within that 12 to 18 months, and you know that for a fact, then you should consider putting a lease in place straight away. A lease doesn't have to last, 10, 15 years. There's a reason why we suggest those figures, but we would definitely suggest at this point, you've got an uncommon party, you don't know what's going to happen in the future, you have no progress in terms of purchasing them, you've not got the funds to purchase them out, put a lease in place. Leases that last over 7 years, so the term of the lease is over 7 years, will always attract stamp duty land tax, and that's because they should always be registered with land registry. So anything over the 7-year mark will always attract stamp duty land tax, and they will all be registered with land registry. Anything under that doesn't necessarily get registered, and potentially might not attract stamp duty land tax. But it could, so that's more of a legal aspect and an accountancy aspect to check that. Right, so kind of once we've dealt with what a lease is, when's it needed, there are several different types of leases. What the main basis is that they differ on is repairing obligations. Now, repairing obligations is a big part of when a surveyor works, I guess, to help create these leases for you. It's the one that everybody gets stuck on the most, because the two main ones that everybody always brings up is who's looking after the boiler and who looks after the roof, and then the other ones are windows and doors. Those things there always get brought up as to who looks after what, and that's when the lease and it comes into its own benefit, because different repairing obligations under different leases will mean different things for different people. So first and foremost, currently, if you're on notional rent, a hypothetical lease that the district value uses is a tenant's internal repairing lease. So that means that the tenants look after the internal skin of the property, everything from plastering, they look after from practice accounts. The structure, the external and the insuring obligations of the property are passed to the landlord or the owner, and the owner receives the full rent to do that. So the practice or the tenant are using practice funds, practice accounts to deal with the internal repairs that are needed. For example, the roll vinyl flooring is coming away and it needs replacing. That is an internal repair. The tenant, the practice, pass the rent up to the owner/landlord, and the landlord's repairing would be, for example, the roof is leaking, the landlord would need to repair that. Or, for example, the insuring, so they have to provide you an insurance certificate of the building, not the content, just the building. So they're the types of things that we always come into consideration for. Now, the landlord is responsible for the cost of external repairs. So external repairs would be, for example, if you've got gardens, car parks, any pathways up to the surgery, they would all be landlord's responsibility. The landlord pays for the insurance obligations. So that's the building insurance, not contents, as I've said. And the tenant is responsible for internal repairs and maintenance of those repairs. Now, the big one that this one stands out for is the boiler, because the boiler technically is inside the premises. And it can go either way. Is it part of the structure? Is it part of the internals? It can be argued either way. And this is where you're going to find that the majority of negotiations land for when people are putting in leases between the owners and the GP tenant. Now, we sometimes see that, for example, on the boiler, the landlord takes on the cost of replacing the boiler, the plant, as it were, but the maintenance cost stays with the tenant. Now, maintenance would be, so for example, you have to provide the servicing agreement and say that you've stuck to that. And then repairing obligations could go either way. It just depends on what's negotiated. We try and stick to the maintenance in terms of the boiler, as long as the tenant shows that they've kept up to date with the servicing of the boiler. Then any other repairs or changes of the boiler go to the landlord to deem what they're going to do with it and pay for that. So yeah, a tenant's internal repairing, it's the one that's most common to the market. And when I say the market, I mean when we're selling GP premises, it's the one that comes up time and time again. So that it does mean that it sticks to the run through from notional rent. So notional rent is based on currently a hypothetical lease of 15 years, 3 yearly rent reviews, tenant's internal repairing obligations. So for a GP tenant, the actual structure of what goes on in the property doesn't actually change if you continue to have a tenant's internal repairing lease that's just basically written in a format for you. So nothing should change. You should still use practice funds for the internal repairs of the property, and then the owners / landlords should look after everything else for you. In regards to a different type of lease, there are a couple of others, but I'll only go through tenants internal repair and full repair and insuring today. Full repairing and insuring means that the tenants take on the liability or the obligation or the responsibility, there's a lot of words that we use for it, to look after the whole property, but because they've taken on that responsibility, they retain a partial part of the rent. Now, this swings between 4% to 8%. The norm is kind of 5%, unless you're in a converted house that was from the 30s, let's say. You're going to look at retaining about 5% of your current notional rent. But if you're in an older building that's converted, that needs a lot of work done, you're looking at probably 7.5%. So 5% for anything that's kind of newer, purpose-built, and then older buildings that are conversion buildings that are houses or anything like that, 7.5%. The 4 to 8% that is on the slide is copied from the premises cost directions. Now, you can put in these figures, but the majority sit between 5 and 7.5% in terms of what gets actually put in the lease and agreed by ICB. So what are the tenants looking after to retain that part of the rent? They're looking after the internals and externals for repairing and servicing and maintenance. And they're also looking after the insuring of the property. Now, I don't believe 5% is an awful lot of money to be able to do that. you'd be able to, if you've not got leases already and it is something that you're interested in looking at, you'd be able to work out quite quickly how much money that would be to you to do it. Are they more desirable? Maybe slightly. Because you can look at investors, if somebody's coming to purchase the property or you're looking to sell afterwards, you've put your lease in place, they tend to be a little bit more desirable in the fact that investors from further afield are more interested because they don't have to be close by to be able to help with any repairing of the property if that's needed. But it's a lot of aspects of a property to look after. The ICB quote that it should be 2.5% for repairs and 2.5% for insuring obligations. And if it's on an older building, again, it should be 5% for repairs, 2.5% for insuring again. So that's how the ICB look at it and have stated it to us. But I think it's not enough money sometimes to look after these properties. And then the rest of the rent will go to the owners / landlords. So you're only retaining 5% potentially of that rent. So lease terms from a landlord's perspective. So if you currently have a property and you're looking to put a lease in place with the GP tenant, from a landlord's perspective, you're going to be looking at, do I want it to be tenants internal repair or full repair and insuring? So a landlord usually would say full repair and insuring because then they just have the rent coming in, don't have to worry about the repairs. You know, it's being looked after by the GP tenants who are there all the time. It's more protection for them potentially. But there's less of a headache involved with it sometimes, and from an investor's point of view. Lease length's really important. So in regards to kind of lease length, you are looking at a longer lease being better than a shorter lease, because the risk of it being empty, the building being empty, is lower, because you've got a longer lease put in place with that GP tenant. I think that in the current market, a landlord's looking for roughly 15 years, unless you're in something brand spanking new, and then you'd be looking at probably 20. In previous years, we've said, you know, you would be looking at 20 years, and in something brand spanking new is 25. But that's changed a lot since, you know, there's not as much developments going on in the areas for GP premises. There's not a lot of new buildings popping up, so that just generally means lease lengths get a little bit shorter until we see these new buildings start popping up again. So it's always interesting to see who's wanting what kind of lease length. A landlord or an owner will always want the longest possible, unless they've got some idea of a development for that site potentially. Rent review provisions. Now, usually these run along the same as your notional rent reviews would. So every 3 years, open market rent, which means that it's subject to the district valuer coming out and viewing the property, looking at the lease, creating the rent, the initial starting rent, and then reviewing it every 3rd year for it. Very similar to your notional rent and how it's calculated. The only time we see a difference in that is if we have something more commercial. And what I mean by that is that you could sometimes see leases that have been created with a different third party in mind. For example, dentistry, pharmacy, physio, and it's gone down a more commercial route. And we look at retail price index calculations and things like that. The standard and the norm there would be to make sure that there is a district value and negotiation in your rent reviews. Armageddon clause. Armageddon clause is one that we put in there as basically a safety net. And the reason why we put a safety net in is I think we all hear rumblings of the NHS and what rent review provisions are going to be like and what the estate strategy is going to be like, and will there be a rental reimbursement potentially still, what that's going to look like. So the Armageddon clause protects against that. So it's called the Armageddon clause, I think, because if we ever lost the NHS, it would be a bit like Armageddon. And what that means is that if, for example, the NHS ceased to exist, or he went into liquidation or something like that, then all the leases that have an Armageddon clause in would basically be ceased to exist, because you have no way of paying the rent, because your rental reimbursement with how you receive your rent is cut off. It's no longer there. So we call it the Armageddon clause because that allows the GP tenants to get out of the property or to renegotiate the lease, so that there is an avenue that you can pay your rent. Break clauses are completely different to an Armageddon clause, and it's really important that we understand this in the same fact that an Armageddon clause is only put into existence if the NHS ceased to exist. A break clause can be put in at any time point in your lease, and that they do affect your value. If you ever come to sell, if you ever came to get a market valuation done, a break clause can affect the value of the property. It can also affect your desirability. It can affect who you attract, because what you're doing is you're putting in a point in time where there is a risk for a GP tenant to leave the property, which then means for a landlord there's a point in time where a GP could leave, and then the rental income stream just goes, and then he has to source somebody to come into the property at his own cost, and then there's a cost factor to that. So a landlord would like to see no breaks in there. They'd like to see what we call a full 15-year lease, because that means he will receive rental income for a full 15 years through the NHS rental reimbursement system, and there's no worries there for it being cut off. Now, a break clause, we usually see it say something like at the 10th anniversary of the lease, the tenant and the landlord will have the right 6 months prior to serve notice to initiate the break clause. Now, break clauses can be landlord driven, tenant driven, and they can also have both parties attached to it. And what I mean by that is you can have a break clause that can only be put into effect by a tenant, or you can have a break clause that can only be put into effect by a landlord, or you have break options that allow both parties to break at the same period in time. A landlord who's purchasing the property, or a landlord in general, will ideally want to see no break clauses in there because it does affect their revenue stream. So from a tenant's perspective, when we're looking at leases, these are the kinds of things that I would ask. So if I was a GP, a practice manager, anybody who's going to work under the obligations of the lease, these are the things that I would ask myself. I would ask myself, how long do I plan to stay in this property? Walk around the property and take it all in like fresh eyes, like you've never gone to the property before in your life, and you walk around it and you go, do I like it here? Do I think it's fit for purpose? Are there problems within the surgery? And kind of work backwards from that. If you walk around it and you go, no, I can see myself being here for a long time, can see myself working here for a long time, and by a long time I mean anything over 5 years, that's a chunk of time to be somewhere. Do I think the building is fit for purpose? Do you go around and can you see, well, yeah, there's a few cracks in the wall, or, you know, there's a bit of, there's a crack above the windows, there's a bit of a draft, or whatever it might be. Are they major things or are they minor things that actually neither here nor there? A major thing would be like, I know for a fact every winter my basement floods. You know, do I want that? Is there rising damp from that? Are there problems with the electrics because of that? Is this building fit for purpose to be a GP centre for the next umpteen years? And when I say umpteen years, the likelihood is of anything between 10 and 15 years. Is it going to stand the test of time? Or does money have to be thrown at the situation to fix up the building? Is it part of the NHS future estate strategy? All leases as best practice. So in regards to best practice, all leases should be sent to the ICB or NHS for their district value for money report. I can't stress enough how much, from a tenant's perspective, how important that is. It's best practice to do it anyway. That secures your knowledge in whether the estates team think you are going to be in that building for the next 15 years, that or the next 10, or however long that lease is that you're looking to put into effect. That secures that rent for that amount of time, because what's happening is the district valuer and the NHS are looking at that property for you as well and going, do they fit our estate strategy for the next 15 years, which is what this lease wants to be put in place? Yes or no? So it's really important from your side, from a tenant perspective, to get that agreement and to get that knowledge. Because if they come back and go, oh, actually, no, we're only happy to sign off a 5-year lease on this property, you can go back and say, where are you planning to put us after 5 years then? What is the plan? Where do you want us? Where do you see these patients being serviced? And it gives you control over, or as much control as you can get over, what does the future look like for this practice as well. Now, normally the NHS come back and go, yeah, absolutely, that's fine, that problem 15 years, great. And so you know you kind of, okay, not a problem, good to go. And you can see that you're part of the future estate strategy. I have had it happen with clients before where the estate team have come back and gone, actually, no, we think we're only happy to sign off a 10-year lease on this property. And you go, okay, that's not a problem. And then we do some calculations and we do some changes to the lease and we change the rent. So it's gone from what we would place it in a 15 years to what we would place in a 10 years, which is slightly higher, because you want to be able to make up the shortfall that you're not going to be receiving 5 years worth of rent at some point on the property. And when you do that, what happens is then, whoopsies, what you do then is when the ICB relook at it with a higher rent put in place, they then go, well, actually, maybe it is part of the future estate strategy because we don't want to pay a higher rent up front and then get to year 10 and go, actually, no, we still need you to be in that property, and then still pay a higher rent. So then they reevaluate, relook at it, and then they're happy to sign 15-year lease off. Sometimes that doesn't happen, and sometimes they are quite happy to sign off a 10-year lease with a higher rent in place. So it's all these kinds of tactics and kind of future planning and looking at what we can do to see whether you're going to fit into the NHS estate strategy. Now, for me, that's a big control element to it, I guess, to be able to have that kind of knowledge. The changes that the NHS sometimes makes in their estate strategy take a long time to come into fruition. I've got a building currently that's been waiting 7 years for the NHS to build them a new building. It's been on the cards for the last 7 years. It's been promised. They've only just purchased the land for this development. So for anything like that, you know, actually, well, there's still another 5 years off maybe from actually being in that property. And that allows the practice to be able to future-proof and plan, recruit, look at what they're going to need. All that sort of stuff is getting put in place. Who's the landlord going to be? This is a huge one, I think, if you're going to remain the tenants. So what I mean by if you're going to remain the tenants, if you are currently GPs who are looking to retire and put a lease in place, then the tenants are the people you've worked with. But in regards to GPs who are still working as tenants, is the building being sold to somebody else further down the line? Is the idea that it's going to be sold straight away? Who's the landlord going to be at the start of this lease? Now, there is nothing to say whoever starts this lease will be at the end of this lease on either side of the matter, landlord or tenant. However, if you know that the person who's coming on as the owner is a big conglomerate, or if you know they are Joe Bloggs down the street, it does sometimes affect your thinking on it. For example, Joe Bloggs down the street, you could probably ring up on a Friday at 4 o'clock and be like, we've got a leak, Joe. Can you come and sort it? And he'd probably be like, oh, can you get somebody out to sort it? And he'd probably be like, oh, I don't know. Or potentially, or he might be a very well-rounded landlord and he'll go, absolutely, no problem. I'll have somebody out tomorrow morning. Just be aware that I'll be entering the property. Or you could have a big conglomerate be your landlord. It takes you an hour to get through the reception lines and you go, we've got a leak on Friday afternoon, and they go, no problem. Well, I've got somebody out in the area within the next hour. Can you stay on site for them? So there are different things that happen dependent on what kind of landlord you've got. I would say the big thing is do you know them? Have you ever met them? Or, okay, we have never met them. We don't know them from Adam, but we've heard really good things. We know Dr. Jones's surgeries are owned by them, and we've asked them for reviews and they're very happy with how they've worked. So yeah, so it's a big thing to know who your landlord's gonna be if you can. Who will sign the lease? This is from the GP standpoint in terms of tenants. So in regards to who should sign the lease, it should always be the person on the GMS, PMS, APMS contract. So whoever is signing on that should be the person signing on this lease, plus a minimum of one other person. Any lease has to have a minimum of 2 signatories. It's really important. Ideally, you would have more. So it's a minimum of 2, a maximum of 4. Now, if you're a big practice, I would say max it out, get 4 people to sign it. And if you've got further people on it, place that with your partnership agreement and say that in your partnership agreement, we are a leasehold premises. If somebody retires and they come off the lease, any partner within the practice is requested to go on to the signing of the lease. You can do it that way, but you always have to have a minimum of 2. You should always keep the lease up to date. So if anybody does retire, they should no longer be on that lease. The other thing to mention is you shouldn't, if you've only got 2 people on that lease, you can't really retire until you have somebody be able to sign you off that lease. Because you can't really let anybody into that property if you're not managing it. So yeah, so it's really important to know who's going to sign the lease. So if you're creating a lease at the minute, you need to know who's going to be signing it. So if you come to me and you said, I've only got one person who's happy to sign it, I'd say you need to find somebody else. Or we're going to go down a different option because you can't, there is no just one person signing it, it has to be 2. If you came to me and said, I've got 4 people willing to sign it, it'd be like, yeah, great, no problem, crack off. Or you came to me and said, look, I've got 3 people. However, one of them's looking to retire in a year. Is it worth it? And I'm probably like, it's probably not worth them signing the lease, if I'm completely honest with you. Is there anybody else, or we'll just go in with two? That's absolutely fine. So there is a systematic way of looking at it as well. Benefits for having a lease for a tenant. Legally and technically, if you have any differences in owner-occupier, you no longer qualify for notional rent. But if you don't have an approved lease in place, and when I say approved, I mean that the ICB have seen the lease and gone through the value for money report and said, yep, we're happy with that. Not a problem. We promise to pay your rent for the X number of years. If you don't have that, then again, legally, they don't have to pay your rent reimbursement. So it's really important that if you do have any changes of owner-occupier, if you are looking to put a lease in place, the reason behind you doing it is because it actually secures your rental reimbursement. You're not going to lose out if you don't have that. So if you have a lease that's not approved by the ICB, technically they still don't have to pay your rental reimbursement. They can pay whatever they deem necessary. If you're currently on notional rent, but you should have a lease in place, they don't have to pay your notional rent, because they say you need to formally, they'll say you need to formally occupy. My words today. You need to formalise the occupation of the building, which means you need to notify that you're actually in a lease property, put a lease in place to formalise the rights and obligations of the building, and then they'll pay you your rent. It doesn't happen very often where the NHS pull rent, but I have seen it happen, and I think it's really important that it's a benefit to you to put a lease in place to make sure you can still receive rental reimbursement for the duration of the lease, and you don't miss out on anything. It avoids disputes. When I say avoids disputes, it's avoiding disputes, I would say 9 times out of 10 over repairs. I would say that the disputes tend to come with the boiler's gone pop. It's not our job to look after it, and the landlord goes, it's not my job to look after it. So having a lease in place where it clearly defines who looks after what, it'll avoid the dispute. It'll avoid that. It'll avoid any costs with that. So it's really important. NHS improvement grants. If you are in a property where you don't have a lease in place, the owners no longer are in the premises, so you should have a lease in place, you technically can't apply for an NHS improvement grant, or any grant really, because you don't own the property. So the NHS will view it as you don't actually have a legal right to be within that premises. So they won't offer any funds for that. Once you had a lease in place, as long as you have got the necessary time left on your lease to pay back the improvement grant, then the NHS will still approve you for them. It used to be, before the new premises cost directions, it used to be that you had to have 10 years remaining on your lease for any improvement grants to be received. But now I think that has changed to say that if you have enough enough time left on the lease to pay back the improvement grant, then you can still apply for it. But I'd have to check that. A specified term. So what that means is it tells you how long you have on that lease, tells you how long you have the right to be in that building for. There is no one who can take you out of that building if you're doing everything in the lease. So if you're looking after the internals of the property, if you're doing everything that you should, if you're allowed to be in there for that amount of time. Right to renew. The majority, if not all, leases that I see or come into contact with all have the right to renew, which means that you, under the 1954 Act, Landlord and Tenants Act, if you have within that act, it means that you can renew your lease under the same terms. So you don't have to worry that you've actually only got this property for 15 years, because if you're within the act, you can just renew it straight after with no issues given. All right. And yeah, as we've been saying, it gives you a clear indication of what you should look after and whose cost it should be. So it gives you a good idea that you should look after the internals potentially, and it's to your own cost. Okay. If you have a full repairing and insuring lease, it gives you a clear understanding that you are to look after the whole of the property and you'll retain 5%. What is deemed as the whole of the property? It could be that you look after windows, doors, or it's, you know, sketched out into a plan in your lease, but it will say something like you are to look after the internals, externals, insuring of the property and structure of the property. It'll say something like that. So just as a bit of a forward facing thing, we've discussed it as we've gone through the webinar. When we're putting in leases, there has to be a reason why we're creating a lease. Is the reason that GPs have retired and we haven't had the funds to purchase them out of the property? If so, do the GPs still want to hold it, or are we looking to sell it for them? This is called a sale and leaseback. So what that means is that we're putting in a lease with the sole purpose to sell. Now, if the GPs are different and what I mean by that is people who are going to remain within the premises are different to the ones who are exiting but will still receive the monies from the sale. If those two entities are different, then there's going to be a difference in need. So usually what it means is the people who are looking to sell, they want to achieve the best price on the market, and the people who are staying within the premises, they want to achieve the best for the lease. Those things don't necessarily mean they're on the same path, because you as tenants might not be willing to sign a 15-year lease, whereas that is what the people who are selling want, because that's the maximum sale price that they could achieve on that. So there's not sometimes always a straight avenue forward. We would say if we're looking for a sale and leaseback opportunity, the best time to do it is when everybody's still in position. So we're still looking at the GPs owning and occupying their property, and they're going to do so for a while. And these GPs tend to forward plan and see that actually they're going to retire in 5 years. They're already struggling to recruit. Why not offload the big burden, which is the property, and sort out the lease now while they're still in situ and, you know, everything's tickety-boo running along nicely. A sale and leaseback is succession planning at its finest, if you like. It requires a lease, but it requires a fair lease that is ICB approved. So that should cover everybody, tenants and landlords. If it's ICB approved, it should be classed as a fair lease normally. But it allows you to sell the property. So that, I think, if sale and leaseback opportunities arise for the practice, it should be a forward-thinking element to it. So in summary for this webinar, and then if we've got questions, we've got a bit of time. Leases are required when there's uncommon parties within the premises. So the owners no longer work within premises. You should instruct specialists. If there is a difference in owner-occupier, so if there are already owners who have left the premises to the people in tenants, you should both have separate specialists working for you, separate solicitors, separate surveyors. If you don't have that and you're actually looking to do a sale and leaseback and the owners work within premises still, you can all have one. It's fine, because the owners will be tenants as well. But yeah, when you're instructing who works for who, usually we say separate parties, separate specialist teams. And yeah, the only thing, if you take only one thing away from this webinar, is always, 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 always send your lease to the NHS for their approval before you sign the lease. You want that value for money report sat in your emails or sat in your post before you sign any lease. But yeah, that's it. So happy to take any questions you might have. But yeah, thanks very much for joining.
There's not been any questions in the chat, so if anyone does have a question, someone raised a hand. Okay, as there's not that many people, I'll just unmute microphones if that's okay. Wait a second.
Oh, wait.
Hello, we should be able to hear you now.
Is that first show now?
Yes.
Yeah.
If the medical partners
Yeah.
who are currently in the medical partnership will soon be the property partners, so they'll be all the same GPs will all be on the property partnership too.
Yeah.
Do they still need a lease then in order to get the notional rent?
No.
Okay.
No. So if you own the property and work within the property and all those people are exactly the same, you're automatically deemed for notional rent.
Thank you.
That's okay.
There's nothing else in the chat. If anyone else does have any questions, that's fine. And we'll send through the slides as well after the session, and a recording of the session as well, in case you'd like to share it with any colleagues, or there's kind of any details that you missed, you can watch it back. So I'll send all that out tomorrow. As I said, we've got some more time until 2 o'clock. If you do have any questions, just let us know. You can just put your microphone on and we can have a quick chat. If not, thank you for all coming.